The simple life isn't something you conquer, it's something you accept. Most men believe they need to add something in order to live better, when in truth, all they really need is to let go of what they're already carrying in excess. Whoever tries to force simplicity the same way he forced success ends up with nothing more than trading one prison for another. It's like trying to put out a fire by throwing more wood on it. Every effort only deepens the very problem it's trying to solve. Hermann Hesse understood this back in the early 20th century, when the world began to accelerate in a way that nobody knew how to name. He watched modern man being born, and he predicted, with a precision that still stings today, the silent exhaustion that so many people now mistake for fate, without realizing they're simply paying the price of a life that was never truly their own. In Steppenwolf, published in 1927, Hesse introduces us to Harry Haller, a cultured, sensitive man, torn between the desire to belong to bourgeois society and a deep disgust for everything that society represents. Harry eats at ordinary restaurants, watches the well-dressed passers-by, listens to the shallow laughter on the streets, and feels, deep in his chest, a loneliness that no amount of company can cure. He isn't depressed in the clinical sense. He's exhausted in the existential sense. There's a brutal difference between the two, and the modern world insists on treating them as though they were the same thing. And the world doesn't listen. Existential exhaustion doesn't respond to vacations. It doesn't disappear with a promotion, a trip, or a new relationship. It's the quiet result of years spent living an existence that, deep down, you never really chose for yourself. Your goals were suggested by the market. Your tastes were programmed by algorithms. Your opinions were borrowed from voices you can't even remember first hearing. And then you hit 30, 40, 50, and you discover that you've spent most of your life performing a script that somebody else wrote. That's the price of living a borrowed life. There's a specific passage in Steppenwolf that you might recognize right away. Harry Haller climbs an anonymous staircase in some boarding house, and halfway up, he stops in front of a vase of well-tended plants, a clean rug, the faint smell of floor wax, and he feels an almost physical envy of that small, orderly, predictable world. He would give anything to be one of those men, the ones who eat dinner at the same time every night, who sleep without any crisis, who don't question the order of things, and at the same time, in the very next second, he feels a deep disgust for that same life. This back and forth, this swinging between the desire for comfort and revulsion at that same comfort, is the sharpest portrait of the contemporary middle-class man. He wants stability, but it suffocates him from within. He wants adventure, but it terrifies him when he's outside of his stability, and he lives in a limbo that's neither one thing nor the other. That limbo comes at a heavy cost. It slowly erases the ability to feel pleasure in ordinary things. Breakfast loses its flavor. A conversation stops moving you. A sunset becomes a backdrop for a photo you'll never look at again. Everything starts happening behind frosted glass. You're present without really being there. You eat without tasting. You hear without listening. And in that moment, when life becomes a performance you're staging for yourself, the symptoms start showing up in the body. Nighttime teeth grinding, a lower back pain that never goes away, a tightness in your chest on Sunday nights, insomnia with no apparent cause. The body knows what the mind still refuses to admit. The body always collects. Hesse tackles this point almost brutally in Demian, a novel from 1919 written under the pseudonym Emile Sinclair. He says, in essence, that most men put on a personality that isn't theirs from a very early age, the way you might slip on a piece of hand-me-down clothing. School hands you the first one. Your parents hand you the second. The company hands you the third. And a man spends his entire life adjusting these layers, without ever asking whether, underneath them, there's actually someone there. The first sign of awakening doesn't come as some grand epiphany. It arrives as a vague, almost imperceptible discomfort, a sudden feeling of strangeness in the middle of a meeting, in the middle of a conversation, in the middle of a Sunday afternoon, when you look at yourself and think, this isn't me. And what makes it even more complicated is that, when that discomfort shows up, the modern instinct is to smother it. You open another tab, you place an order on the app, you book a trip, you buy something. The entire world is engineered so that that 1 minute of honesty never ends in awareness. It ends in consumption. Hesse could already see this mechanism forming back in the early 20th century, when shop windows were starting to replace altars and marketing was starting to replace philosophy. The man he describes in Steppenwolf is the same man who today lives in a luxury condo, has 4 streaming subscriptions, and yet, come Saturday, has no idea what to do with himself. There's a passage in Demian in which Sinclair describes the difference between 2 worlds that coexisted in his childhood. One was the world of his parents' house, with its clean plates, religious hymns, polite words, and visible order. The other was the world of the street, of alleys, fights, secrets, and older boys who stole fruit. And Sinclair discovers, while still a boy, that he doesn't fully belong to either one of them. That there's a third thing inside him, something that doesn't fit into the official dichotomy. Hesse uses that scene to say, in no uncertain terms, that every man, at some point, has to admit that he doesn't fit the mold he was raised in, and that denying that realization is choosing to be sick. That passage tends to hit adult men hard when they read it late in life. Many of them spent decades trying to force their bodies, their calling, their natural rhythm, into a shape that was never meant for them. A naturally introspective guy convincing himself that he has to love loud parties, swallowing his own silence as if it were a defect. That's the quietest way of getting sick. And it collects its bill somewhere around 35, 40, when the fuel of youth runs out and the real cost of the counterfeit hits all at once. There's a very specific clue hidden inside Hesse's novels about when the real awakening actually begins. It isn't where you'd probably look for it first. We'll come back to that clue later because it changes the way you see everything from that point on. The illusion of accumulation is the second great sickness Hesse diagnoses. In Siddhartha, a novel published in 1922 and inspired by his engagement with Eastern philosophy, the main character, a young Brahmin, sets out in search of the truth. He passes through ascetics, through the spiritual masters he met along the way, through rivers, through courtesans, and ends up getting involved with one of them, and with a wealthy merchant. Siddhartha learns how to make money, how to wear expensive clothes, how to drink wine, how to gamble, and the more he accumulates, the emptier he becomes. There comes a moment in the book when he looks at himself in the mirror and no longer recognizes what he sees. The spiritual man had been devoured by the prosperous one, and that loss was silent, gradual, almost invisible, the way it happens for almost everyone. It's worth spending a little more time with Siddhartha because the character's arc describes, with almost clinical precision, the stages that almost every contemporary man goes through. He starts out young, full of spiritual conviction, determined to find some absolute truth. He spends years living as an ascetic, sleeping on the ground, fasting, meditating. Then he walks away from that path and dives into the opposite. He learns to love. He learns to make money. He learns to drink, to gamble, to possess. And in that plunge into the material world, he becomes exactly what he had once despised in his youth. A comfortable, bored, sleepwalking man. What Hesse shows us, without any sentimentality, is that this second phase wasn't a detour. It was part of the path. Siddhartha had to go through that experience to discover in his own skin that no amount of accumulation can satisfy the deepest desire of a human being. He had to possess everything in order to understand that none of it was him. And there's a specific night in the novel when that awareness hits him. He wakes up before dawn next to the courtesan, looks at the luxurious room, at the clothes thrown over the chair, at his own aging body, and feels a deep nausea. Not because of the lust itself, but because of the sudden realization that he was living an existence that was no longer his own, and it was from that nausea that he was able to start over. That scene echoes for any man who has ever woken up at 3 a.m, staring at the bedroom ceiling, feeling, without being able to explain it, a sadness that wasn't there the day before. The body sends out the clearest signal it can manage in that moment. Something here needs to change. And the immediate instinct, once again, is to smother it. Roll over, grab the phone, scroll through social media, until sleep comes back. But that escape is exactly what prevents the change from happening. The nighttime sadness is a messenger. When you listen to it, part of the road has already been walked. When you silence it, it comes back the next night, a little bit heavier. A simple life, for Hesse, doesn't begin by throwing objects away. It begins by admitting, without any beating around the bush, that excess is almost always an attempt to fill a hole that no purchase is ever going to fix. That overstuffed wardrobe, that closet full of pieces still with tags on them, that shelf of books never opened, that car bigger than you actually need, all of that is a symptom, not a cause. And as long as a man treats the symptom without looking at the cause, he's going to keep accumulating, emptying out, and accumulating again, in a cycle that usually only ends when the body finally gives out. A health crisis, a divorce, an unexpected firing. You have to wait until that point. You don't have to. There's an image in Siddhartha that might be the most powerful in the entire book. It's the moment when he decides to leave city life behind and starts walking again with no destination until he reaches the banks of a river. And the ferryman Vasudeva, a simple man who spent his entire life there, takes him in, teaches him to live with little, and invites him into a single practice. Listen to the river. Don't interpret it, don't judge it, don't use it, just listen. And it's in that listening, which lasts for years, that Siddhartha finally finds what he was searching for. Not in a temple, not in a book, not in wealth, in silence. And here we come to the third territory that has to be reclaimed. Silence. Not the bad kind of silence, the kind the modern world associates with unwanted loneliness. Built silence. Silence as a listening field. Hesse was a man of long retreats. He would spend days walking alone in the Alps, writing in pocket notebooks, tending to the garden of his house in Montagnola, Switzerland, where he lived from 1919 until his death in 1962. He created enough distance from the world to be able to hear himself. And that distance is exactly what contemporary life robs from us with such efficiency. Think about how many hours a week you actually spend without any stimulation at all. No background music, no podcast, no notification, no screen, no conversation. Probably somewhere between 0 and 20 minutes. And still you expect to know yourself, to know what you want, to understand why you feel the way you do. It's not going to happen. Self-knowledge doesn't sprout in a noisy environment. It requires a kind of emptiness that most people haven't experienced since childhood. And that's why the first practical action on any Hessian path towards simplicity is this. Reclaiming 15, 20, 30 minutes a day of absolute silence. Nobody can stand it at first. The first few days you try sitting down and doing nothing, no screen, no music, no task. Your brain starts to scream. A restlessness shows up that feels almost physical. You want to get up, check your phone, start doing anything. That discomfort is precisely the reason you have to keep going. It's the proof that there's something underneath the noise that you've been avoiding meeting, and that something is always the same thing. You. Without the filter, without the persona, without the construction, and it's from that encounter that a simple life becomes possible. Before that, any attempt to simplify things on the outside is going to fail, because on the inside, chaos is still running the show. There's an important principle here, and it was carefully explored by Blaise Pascal, a 17th century French philosopher, in his Pensées, published posthumously in 1670. Pascal wrote a line that became famous. He said that all of humanity's unhappiness comes from one thing alone, which is not knowing how to sit quietly in a room. In other words, 3.5 centuries before the smartphone, he had already diagnosed the fact that human beings, unable to bear their own silence, invent endless distractions so they never have to encounter themselves. Wars, games, parties, trips, business ventures. All of it, according to Pascal, is escape. And Hesse, without quoting him directly, arrived at a similar conclusion by another route. The man who can't stand being alone with himself is a slave to everything else that exists outside of him. This shouldn't be read as a condemnation of the active life, but as a call to alternation. A healthy man needs both action and rest, stimulation and silence, company and solitude. Modern life broke that alternation. It replaced rest with the infinite scroll, solitude with permanent connection, one's own thinking with the consumption of other people's thinking. The result is a man who is never truly alone, and who, paradoxically, feels lonelier and lonelier as a result. Because real solitude and the presence of oneself walk together. Where one doesn't exist, the other doesn't either. What's interesting is that this loss has consequences that most people can't trace back to the source. A work meeting where you had trouble forming your own opinion. An argument at home that you couldn't steer with any clarity. A decision put off for weeks with no apparent reason. A recurring sense of being one step behind your own day. All of that usually has the same root. The absence of daily spaces of real silence, where your own thinking could organize itself before being demanded by the world. Whoever lives in permanent noise just reacts. Whoever carves out silence decides. Hesse comes back, Endymion, to what may be the most quoted line in his work. Destiny and temperament are two names for the same concept. What he's trying to say with that is simple and devastating. Your life isn't going to be designed by spreadsheets. It's going to be designed by who you are, by your deepest inclinations, by your natural talents, by your particular fragilities. Ignoring all of that and trying to copy the life of someone you admire is the fastest recipe for getting sick. And it's what the digital content market sells every single day. Copy that billionaire's routine. Adopt that athlete's habits. Do what that influencer does. None of those paths were made for you. Self-knowledge is the non-negotiable foundation. Start with questions that hurt. What drains me, even when it looks productive? What lights me up, even when it doesn't pay? What am I running from, even when nobody's watching? Write down the answers. Come back to them in a week, in a month. You'll start to see a pattern. And that pattern is the map of your real life, the one that had been buried under everyone else's expectations. Understanding philosophy on your own already helps, but practicing it with someone who already does this every day speeds things up in a way that almost nobody believes until they experience it. And that's exactly the invitation I left in the first pinned comment, in case you want to go deeper instead of just watching. There's a passage in Steppenwolf where Harry Haller discovers that inside him there don't live just two natures, a wolf and a man, as he had believed. Hundreds live there. He is at the same time the father, the son, the critic, the artist, the coward, the brave one, the bourgeois, the rebel. And his anguish came precisely from trying to be only one of those parts, all the time. Hesse had read Carl Jung, and even went through analysis in the Jungian tradition starting in 1916, during a period of severe personal crisis. The influence of the Jungian concept of the shadow runs powerfully through his work. The central idea is this: a simple life is never a sanitized life. It's the life of a man who acknowledges having ambition, anger, fear, desire, pride, and integrates all of it instead of trying to be only good, only productive, only spiritual. This matters because a huge part of modern suffering comes from that amputation. The guy wants to be a saint of productivity and represses healthy laziness. He wants to be a perfect husband and represses legitimate irritation. He wants to be a balanced father and represses real exhaustion. And each one of those repressions over time collects its price in the form of an explosion, an illness, a collapse, or worst of all, a nameless sadness that grows and grows without him noticing. To simplify, in the Hessian sense, is to stop fighting with who you are. It's to lay down your weapons against yourself. It's to realize that all the parts have a function, and the job isn't to kill them, it's to organize them. While that isn't happening, there's another tyrant that keeps dictating the choices of modern man, and it goes by the name of other people's approval. Hesse was rejected many times over the course of his life. His family was deeply religious and wanted him to become a pastor. He was expelled from the Protestant seminary in Maulbronn in 1892 at the age of 14 after an attempt to run away. He went through a severe personal crisis in adolescence with hospitalizations, became a clockmaker's apprentice, then a bookseller, and only started writing professionally in his early 20s. Each of those decisions disappointed somebody important to him, and he kept going anyway. Not out of teenage rebellion, but out of a mature awareness that living to please is a sophisticated way of never really living at all. A simple life demands the courage to disappoint. As long as you organize your schedule around someone else's gaze, your life is going to stay complicated by its very nature. The yes to the invitation you didn't want to accept. The project you took on to prove something. The relationship kept alive for the image it projects. The consumption that exists to be shown off, not to be lived. Each one of those items steals time, energy, and clarity. Their sum adds up to a life that looks big on the outside and is empty on the inside. Hesse knew that mechanism well, and he wrote against it from the very beginning. The practical point here is painful, but necessary. You're going to have to disappoint some people, probably not your enemies, who are already disappointed anyway, but your friends, your family members, your co-workers, the ones who got used to a version of you that maybe was never entirely true. You're going to have to turn down invitations you used to accept automatically. Cut projects that eat up your time without giving anything meaningful back. Leave groups that revolve around gossip, comparison, veiled competition. Each one of those decisions is going to create a small social friction. And each one of them is going to hand a piece of your life back to you. There's a strong internal resistance to that movement. The fear of being forgotten. The fear of missing opportunities. The fear of becoming someone nobody calls anymore. Those fears are normal, they're human, but they need to be looked at head on. Because in most cases, what you lose by saying no is precisely what had already been making you sick. And what you gain in exchange is an empty space in your schedule, which at first feels threatening, and then reveals itself to be the most fertile ground for everything that really matters. Hold on to that phrase, empty space. It's going to come back later, in a context that changes the meaning of everything. There's a scene in Peter Kamenzind, Hesse's first novel, published in 1904, in which the protagonist, a young writer who had moved to the big European cities in search of recognition, decides to go back to his native village in the Alps. He had already achieved some literary success, was frequenting intellectual cafes, had sophisticated friendships, and yet felt more and more unhappy. The return to the village isn't a gesture of failure, it's a gesture of sanity. He reconnects with the mountain, the local wine, the simple townspeople, the long silences, and little by little starts to put himself back together. Hesse is saying something with this that modern psychology has only recently begun to measure. The natural environment heals the human nervous system. There are serious contemporary studies on this. A paper by Roger Ulrich, published in the journal Science in 1984, showed that hospital patients in rooms with a view of trees recovered faster and used fewer painkillers than patients with a view of walls. Research out of Japan, starting in the 80s, popularized the concept of Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing, and documented measurable drops in levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, in people who walk through forested areas. What Hesse intuited as a poet more than 100 years ago is now confirmed science. Nature is medicine. And most men go entire weeks without touching a tree, without looking at a horizon that isn't broken by a building, without sitting on real ground. The practical invitation is modest and transformative. Find a way, once a week at minimum, of being in prolonged contact with open nature. It can be a big park, a short trail, a river, a beach without loud music blaring, an urban forest. Go without headphones, without taking any photos, without producing mental content. Walk, sit, look, listen. At first, it's going to feel like a waste of time. Your mind, trained for productivity, is going to complain. Push through. After a few weeks, something starts to settle back into place. You sleep better. You react with less irritation. You think more clearly. That's the effect no meditation app can reproduce with the same depth. It makes sense, if you think about it for a second. The human nervous system was calibrated over hundreds of thousands of years in direct contact with natural landscapes. The dense cities most people live in today showed up yesterday in evolutionary terms. The brain is still expecting trees, running water, earth beneath its feet, an open horizon. When it doesn't get any of that for months on end, it enters a permanent state of low-grade hypervigilance, a readiness for danger that the city constantly produces, with sirens, honking horns, Flashing screens, non-stop notifications. Reintroducing regular doses of nature is, in practical terms, a way of giving the body back the environment it was designed for, and you can feel it in a matter of weeks. Hesse was a compulsive walker. He wrote, in 1920, a short book called Wandering, or Wanderung in the original German, in which he brings together texts and watercolors produced during his hikes in the Alps. For him, walking was a way of thinking. Hesse belonged to an ancient tradition of thinkers who walked in order to think. And science has confirmed that intuition clearly. A study conducted at Stanford in 2014 showed that people's creativity went up by an average of 60% during and immediately after a walk, compared to the performance of those who stayed seated. Those unsolvable problems you try to figure out in front of the computer, digging through spreadsheets, often dissolve when you get up and walk for 30 minutes with no destination. And here you have one of the cheapest, most accessible, and most underused tools of modern life. A daily walk, no podcast, no music, no destination, just to see what shows up in your head. There's nothing pastoral or romantic about this. It's basic mental hygiene. The head needs those unstructured spaces to digest everything it spends the whole day swallowing. And if you don't give it that space, the processing happens during sleep, hurting the quality of your rest, or it doesn't happen at all, producing that feeling of a saturated mind, cognitive lead, difficulty deciding simple things. Start small, 20 minutes a day, even if it's overcast, even if it's a little cold. The human body was built to walk for hours every day. It walked more in any 18th century village than in any 21st century capital. That has consequences you only feel once you change the habit. Back to Siddhartha, there's a passage that sums up, maybe better than any other in Hesse's work, the heart of the simple life. After years of listening to the river alongside Vasudeva, Siddhartha finally understands. The river is at once the source and the mouth, beginning and end, past and future. Everything is in the same movement, and peace comes from ceasing to fight against that movement, from stopping wanting to separate what is joined, from learning to listen without interpreting, listening to people without already preparing your reply while they're still talking, listening to your own body before you eat to know whether it's real hunger or anxiety, listening to the silence of an empty room for 5 minutes without running from what it brings up. Listening is the opposite of accumulating, and it's one of the most deteriorated capacities of the contemporary man. Watch any conversation. Almost nobody actually listens. People wait for their turn to speak. They prepare arguments while the other person is still in the middle of a sentence. They interrupt, they look at their phones, and then they're surprised when their relationships start emptying out. Listening is an act of presence, and presence is an act of generosity. Whoever truly listens gives the other person the scarcest thing that exists today, their whole attention, and they give it to themselves too. When they listen to their own body, their own intuition, their own inner voice, without the noise of 1,000 other voices. Here's a practical exercise. In the next 3 conversations you have, try not to think about your reply while the other person is talking. Let their words finish, take a real pause, and only then respond. At first, it's going to feel weird. You're going to feel an urgent pull to interrupt, resist it. After a few tries, something shifts. The conversations get deeper. The people around you open up more. And you start to realize how much of your life you were spending on autopilot, just trading words, without actually meeting anyone. There's a quiet detail in the figure of Vasudeva that usually goes unnoticed. He barely speaks. During the years he takes Siddhartha in, his contribution is made almost entirely of presence, attentive gaze, economical gestures. He shows, without any speech, that the deepest wisdom is often the one that needs the least announcing. Hesse builds this character against everything Western culture values, against the eloquent professor, against the charismatic master, against the intellectual who owns the room. Vasudeva is the opposite. He's the man who became the river he learned to listen to. And that's exactly why he's able to teach, because he doesn't try to teach. But none of this works without a minimum structure of routine. And here we come to what may be the most misunderstood point of the Hessian path. A lot of people romanticize the idea of a simple life as though it were absolute freedom. No schedules, permanent spontaneity. It's the opposite. Hesse built his immense body of work inside a modest and repetitive routine. He woke up early. He tended the garden. He wrote for hours. He exchanged letters with writers of his time, thousands of them over the course of his life. He had lunch with his wife Ninon. He read in the afternoon. He walked at the end of the day. He repeated this almost every day for decades. That hidden clue from the beginning about the moment when the awakening actually happens shows up here, in the routine, and not where you were probably expecting to find it. The simple life doesn't sustain itself on intensity. It sustains itself on constancy. Small daily rituals done with attention rebuild a man with far more force than the big overhauls attempted on weekends. A fixed wake-up time, a meal eaten sitting down without a screen, chewing slowly, an hour of reading before bed. A notebook where you write a few lines every day just to check in on yourself. None of this is heroic, and that's exactly why it works. Because it fits into any life, because it doesn't depend on motivation, because it becomes, over time, as automatic as brushing your teeth. And it's there, inside that appearance of banality, that the real awakening happens. Not at the expensive retreat, not in the book you're going to start tomorrow, not in the big decision you promise to make when you finally work up the nerve. It happens in the small, insignificant gesture repeated, day after day, until one day, without warning, you realize you're a different man, without remembering exactly when you changed. That's the secret. Hesse won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1946, and throughout his life he left notes, in letters and essays, about something that sounds almost provocative today. He said that real reading isn't consumption, but a long, unhurried conversation with the author. In an era that sells courses promising 50 books a year, video summaries, apps that condense classic works into 20 minutes, that Hessian vision is almost revolutionary. Depth isn't in the quantity, it's in the lingering. A single book reread 3 times over the course of a life, underlined, discussed with yourself, revisited in different phases, does more for the development of a man than 100 books read superficially, just to fatten up a shelf or a photo caption. Choose, for the next year, 3 books, 5 at most, dense books, ones that demand time. It can be something by Hesse, it can be a classic of philosophy, it can be a long biography, it can be a work of literature you read in your youth and never went back to. Read slowly, underline, write in the margins, come back to the marked pages weeks later. Argue with yourself, disagree with the author, agree. Write in your notebook what it made you think about. That's the reading exercise in the old sense, the one that forms the mind instead of just informing it. And it's one of the quietest and most effective paths toward a simple life that doesn't depend on changing anything external. There's another passage in Siddhartha that has to be handled with care, because it challenges one of the most protected beliefs of contemporary culture, the idea that suffering is always the enemy. Siddhartha, at the end of his life, loses his son, whom he had just reconnected with after years of being separated. The boy, a rebellious teenager, runs off to the city without saying goodbye. And Siddhartha, the man who had already walked so many spiritual paths, sinks into a raw pain, a physical sadness, a grief that he himself doesn't know how to move through. Hesse shows us that it's precisely that suffering that finishes ripening him. It's that pain that puts him on equal footing with all the other ordinary human beings he had been observing, with a certain intellectual distance until then. The point is delicate, but central. The simple life isn't a life without pain. It's a life in which pain is welcomed as part of the process and not hidden away as a system failure. Modern man spends an absurd amount of energy running from any form of emotional discomfort. When faced with grief, he packs his schedule. When faced with failure, he changes the subject. When faced with sadness, he medicates. When faced with emptiness, he consumes. And each one of those escapes ends up collecting a much higher price down the road. What is moved through consciously matures. What is anesthetized rots on the inside. And it's from that painful fermentation, deep in the chest, that the chronic illnesses modern medicine can't always explain are born. That's the price. This doesn't mean going out looking for suffering. It means stopping running from it when it shows up. Sitting with sadness for 20 minutes without opening the phone. Letting grief take up the space it needs, instead of trying to wrap it up in 3 weeks. Recognizing a failure as a failure, learning from it, and moving on, instead of rewriting the story so it looks like a victory in disguise. Hesse saw in that inner work of acceptance the raw material of any real wisdom. Nobody matures only in joy. You mature by walking through what is hard without betraying yourself in the process. There's a philosophical tradition that backs this view up powerfully, and it comes from ancient Stoicism. Seneca, a Roman philosopher of the 1st century, wrote in his letters to Lucilius that men don't suffer so much because of things themselves, but because of the way they interpret those things. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. And suffering is born, most of the time, from our refusal to accept that pain is part of it, that losing is part of it, that aging is part of it, that watching your parents leave this world is part of it, that watching a child grow up and move away is part of it. Each one of those passages, when faced with honesty, leaves a mark, but also a gain, a depth that wasn't there before, a new calm in the face of whatever comes next. Contemporary man has lost almost all of that wisdom. He was trained to believe that any emotional discomfort is a bug that needs to be fixed immediately. If he's sad, he medicates. If he's anxious, he distracts himself. If he's frustrated, he changes plans. That impulse, even if well-intentioned, produces a generation incapable of sustaining any pain for long enough to learn from it. And it's precisely that incapacity that generates the modern compulsions, the excess of eating, of buying, of drinking, of working. All of them clumsy attempts to numb something that only heals when it's felt. There's a dimension of detachment that almost nobody really gets. People hear the word detachment and they think about throwing out old clothes, selling objects, aesthetic minimalism. That's a small part and the easiest part. The hard part, and the part that actually changes your life, is detachment from ideas, from rigid certainties, from identities you defend tooth and nail without even knowing why. Hesse shows, throughout many works, that men full of theories, of inflexible opinions, of frozen images about themselves, are incapable of peace. They live in a permanent state of defense, and defense is the opposite of tranquility. Before emptying out a wardrobe, try emptying out a certainty. The certainty that you have to be the absolute provider. The certainty that it's already too late for you to change fields. The certainty that other people think badly of you. The certainty that the future is going to be bleak. The certainty that your identity is fixed, unchangeable, defined by the past. Each one of those certainties is a silent prison. And what's most interesting is that when you loosen one of them, the outside world starts to seem smaller, lighter, more manageable. Material things lose their urgency. Consumption loses its pull. The wardrobe almost empties itself out because you no longer need it to prop up an image that was crumbling on the inside. In Narcissus and Goldmund, published in 1930, Hesse puts side by side two characters who represent two legitimate and opposite ways of living. Narcissus is the intellectual monk, dedicated to contemplation, study, monastic order. Goldmund is the wandering artist, passionate, sensual, who goes through the world sculpting, loving, suffering, creating. The book doesn't pick one of them as superior. It shows that each temperament has its own path of meaning, and that the tragedy is when one of them tries to live like the other. One of the most powerful themes of the novel is the relationship between work and soul. Hesse questions throughout what a true craft is and what is just a paycheck. And here we come to one of the most practical and most delicate points of all of this. No simple life survives inside a job that humiliates the soul every day. That's just fact. You can meditate, walk in nature, read poetry, eat slowly, But if for 8 hours a day you're swallowing meaningless tasks, serving a market logic you don't agree with, and getting in exchange only the paycheck and the fear of losing the paycheck, no other practice is going to make up for that hole. Nobody has to quit everything tomorrow. That's irresponsible. But you have to start building, in parallel, something that has your signature on it. It can be a personal project developed in your free hours. It can be a gradual migration into a field that makes more sense. It can be a conscious cutting back of expenses to allow, within 2 or 3 years, a change of structure. It can be starting to teach what you've learned, writing about it, sharing it with people who need it. The point is to abandon the silent resignation that work is a place where you suffer in order to pay the bills, and to start redesigning that part of life with attention. Hesse was the opposite of lazy. He worked until his final years, but he worked on what had his signature on it. And that's the difference between a craft and just a job. A reflection that runs through almost all of his work, especially in Narcissus and Goldmund, is that the authentic craft is the one that, even when it tires the body, feeds the soul. Goldmund, the wandering artist, goes hungry, sleeps out in the open, suffers heartbreaks, walks through the Black Plague, and still, every time he finds a block of wood and a knife to carve with, something inside him lights up. That's a long way from surface-level motivational enthusiasm. It's recognition. It's the quiet, deep feeling of doing what you came into the world to do. A lot of people go through their entire lives without ever feeling that even once. And they accept it as though it were normal, as though it were the only possible reality. There's a clear qualitative difference between a job that only generates money and a job that also generates meaning. I'm not talking about the surface passions sold by motivational marketing. I'm talking about coherence, about the possibility of ending the day and looking back without the feeling of having betrayed yourself. That coherence rarely comes from a single job that solves everything. It usually comes from an intelligent composition, a job that supports you financially, plus a side project that supports you spiritually, or a gradual transition over the course of years, in which the second slowly takes the place of the first. There's no single formula. There's a direction, and it has to be recognized early enough for there to be time. In The Glass Bead Game, his most complex work, published in 1943, and one of the main reasons for the Nobel, Hesse builds a future society in which a group of intellectuals dedicates itself to a game that brings together every area of human knowledge in an aesthetic and spiritual synthesis. The protagonist, who rises to the top of that order, then walks away from it because he realizes that contemplative refinement, when disconnected from ordinary life, becomes sterile. Hesse isn't proposing escape from the world. He's proposing a different engagement with it, a more conscious engagement, more chosen, more coherent with who you are on the inside. That passage has a practical implication that rarely gets talked about. There's an entire market today of sophisticated escape dressed up as spirituality. Expensive retreats, contemplation courses with a monthly subscription, closed communities that live inside a bubble of elevated vocabulary. None of that is what Hesse is proposing. His path runs through 6 o'clock traffic, through the grocery bill, through the hard conversation with your partner, through the meeting that drags on. It's inside those ordinary circumstances that the simple life gets tested. Stepping out of ordinary life to live a staged simplicity in a different setting is just another refined form of complication, with the added downside of being expensive. There's a line from Siddhartha, near the end of the book, that might be the most precious in Hesse's entire body of work. He says that the greatest wisdom he learned was to realize that time isn't real, that past and future are constructions of the mind, that the only thing that truly exists is the instant, and that peace comes from surrendering completely to the instant you're in. That sounds like a t-shirt slogan, but when you look at modern life, it's a radical statement. Contemporary man lives in constant anticipation, jumping from the goal that's coming to the purchase that's coming, from the next phase of life to the next stage of his career, always one step ahead of his own body. And between one next and another, real life, the only one there is, slips right by, right? That Sunday lunch with the family, thrown together carelessly because your head was already on Monday. that conversation with your kid, answered on autopilot because your thinking was somewhere else. That walk, taken with an eye on the clock. That night, moved through from screen to screen, with no memory of it the next day. All of that is life draining down the sink, and nobody notices, because everyone is trained to look at the next point, and not at the present. Hesse wanted to give the reader back the ability to be fully in a single instant. And that may be the rarest skill of our time. Presence isn't some mystical state. It's a mundane practice. Eating while paying attention to the flavor. Listening to someone while paying attention to their words. Working while paying attention to what you're doing. Not three things at once. Truly resting when you rest. Without guilt and without any productivity running in the background. Each one of those small gestures is a reaffirmation that life is here now and not at some imaginary point in the future. And the more you practice that, the less the mind runs off into anxious anticipation, the less the body gets agitated, the less the day feels trampled over. There's a Harvard study, published in the journal Science in 2010, that measured how mentally present participants were in what they were doing throughout the day. The result was striking. People spent almost half of their time with their minds somewhere else, far from the activity their body was engaged in. And the most revealing part was that, in those moments of mind wandering, participants reported significantly lower levels of happiness, regardless of what they were thinking about. Even when they were fantasizing about pleasant things, the simple distance from the real experience reduced their satisfaction. Being here, now, matters more for well-being than almost any other measurable variable. That confirms what Hesse wrote in a different way, decades before any empirical study existed. Human unhappiness is, in large part, a matter of one's own absence from one's own moment. Modern life, with its constant notifications, its endless feeds, its culture of anticipation, trains the brain never to be fully where the body is. Reversing that is a work of years, but it starts with very small daily decisions. Leaving the phone in another room during dinner. Doing one thing at a time, not three. Pausing for 10 seconds when the impulse to check something arises and asking whether it's really necessary. Those micro gestures, repeated, rebuild the capacity to be present. We've reached the point where all of this has to land in something you can actually do. And here comes the most delicate turn of the entire argument, the one almost nobody explains properly. Most people wait to change. They stay in a permanent state of ease. One day I'll start, next week I'll start. When I finish this cycle, I'll start. Meanwhile, they look at other people who seem to be changing and feel a quiet, almost embarrassed envy. And it's precisely that waiting that keeps the change from happening. Because whoever waits to change still believes there's a before and an after. That there's a portal, a big decision to be made on a specific date. There isn't. There's something stranger and more radical than that. You're already changing. Right this minute, while you're listening to these words. Every gesture you make with a little more attention, every pause you honor before responding, every second you choose not to grab the phone to fill in an emptiness, is change in the act of happening. You don't change when you decide to change. You change in the exact moment you realize the decision was never necessary. What you decide is to keep noticing. And that continuity is everything. The central mistake of modern life is imagining that deep transformation has to be preceded by an event of equivalent scale, a crisis that levels everything, a 3-week retreat, an irreversible decision announced to the world. When in practice, almost every man who has truly matured has described the process the same way. Little by little, without any spectacle, and above all, without knowing exactly when they started. One morning, when they swapped coffee for 10 minutes of silence at the window. One night, when they closed the phone before 10 instead of scrolling until 1 in the morning. One afternoon, when they said no to an invitation that would have stolen the entire weekend. None of those moments looks important when it happens. All of them, added up, change a man. Hesse knew this. That's why his work doesn't end in a manifesto. It ends in an image. It ends in a scene. It ends in a river, a garden, an aging face looking at some ordinary afternoon. Because the simple life, at bottom, works less like a project you announce and more like a quality of attention you cultivate almost without meaning to. And that's why it's so hard to sell and so easy to live once you stop trying. If you want a direct answer to the question that opens this video, here it is. The smartest way to start a simple life isn't to overhaul anything on the outside first. It's to admit that excess is a symptom, not a cause, and to work on the cause before you touch anything external. And the path, condensed, fits into a few steps that hold each other up. Reclaiming 15 to 30 minutes a day of absolute silence, no screen, no music, no task. Practicing honest self-knowledge with the 3 questions that hurt. What drains me even when it looks productive? What lights me up even when it doesn't pay? What am I running from even when nobody's watching? Reintroducing nature and walking into everyday life with weekly contact with open nature and a daily walk without a podcast. Building small, constant rituals, a fixed wake-up time, 1 meal without a screen, an hour of reading, a notebook where you write a few lines a day, listening more than you speak, in conversations with others, in your own body, in the silence that shows up when you stop running from it. And, underneath all of it, having the courage to disappoint, saying no to what steals time and gives no meaning back. None of those steps is grand on its own. All of them, sustained for months, change an entire man. And that's why the right answer doesn't look impressive on paper. It only makes sense once you live it. Hesse died in 1962, at the age of 85, in his house in Montagnola, surrounded by his garden, his books, and Ninon. He didn't leave behind a spectacular fortune. He left behind a body of work that is still being read in almost every language in the world, and still transforming men and women who come to it tired, scattered, lost, and walk away with some kind of inner compass they didn't have before. And that legacy is available to any of us if we're willing to start today with the closest and most honest gesture within reach. If this video touched you in some way, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you want to go deeper with us, join the Members Club. See you at the next meeting.